Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me fine. And I'd like to introduce the speakers on a very distinguished panel. I'll start with Ausma, since she's sitting next to me. Ausma Zehanat Khan currently lives in Denver, where she's working on her next novel featuring Inspector Isa Khattak and Sergeant Rachel Getty. A frequent lecturer and commentator, Ms. Khan holds a PhD in international human rights law with a research specialization in military intervention and war crimes in the Balkans. She's practiced immigration law in Toronto and has taught international human rights at Northwestern University. Next is Hari Kunzru, whose novels I've greatly enjoyed and plan to teach in Colorado College's Block 4, that's in December. And the one I'll be teaching is The Impressionist, which I'm sure many of you know. And also he has just spoken on his other novel, I think one of the newest ones, called Gods Without Men. His work has been translated into 21 languages and has won prizes, including the Somerset Maugham Award, and Somerset Maugham was one of my passions while I was growing up, the Betty Trask Prize of the Society of Authors, and a British Book Award. In 2003, Granta named him one of its 20 best young British novelists. And his short stories and journalism have appeared in diverse publications, including the New York Times, Guardian, New Yorker, Washington Post, Times of India, Wired, and New Statesman. He lives in New York City. And next is Vijay Seshadri, whom I'm sure you've already heard on panels, who was born in Bangalore, India, and came to America at a very young age. He grew up in Columbus, Ohio, where his father taught chemistry at Ohio State University. His poetry collections include 3 sections which won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, and The Long Meadow, which won the James Laughlin Award, and Wild Kingdom. Vijay Seshadri has received grants from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts, and has been awarded the Paris Review's Bernard Connor's Long Poem Prize and the MacDowell Colony's Fellowship for Distinguished Poetic Achievement. Currently, he teaches poetry and nonfiction writing at Sarah Lawrence College. And at the end, there is Antonio Ruiz-Camacho, who was born in Toluca, is that say it right? Mexico, and for more than, I'm just leaving out the birth years that, are part of the bios, but for more than 18 years, he has occupied every imaginable position in a newsroom, working for publications in Mexico, Europe, and the US. He's taught creative writing to bilingual second graders, sold Mexican handcrafts at a flea market in Spain, and played Santa Claus at a French school in Silicon Valley. A 2009 Journalism Knight Fellow at Stanford and a 2014 Dobie Paisano Fellow sponsored by the Graduate School at UT. He earned his MFA from the New Writers Project at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the author of the story collection Barefoot Dogs, and I was asking him at lunch what he's working on next, and he is working on a novel, so I look forward to reading that, because I really, really enjoyed all your work so much, and it's a privilege to be able to talk to you here. And at lunch, Antonio and I were discussing the title of this panel and agreeing that it was rather open-ended and somewhat vague. So, so in a way, that's a good thing because no one can accuse us of going off topic. So I think actually the understanding of geographical imaginations, I should just quickly introduce myself. I'm Rashna Singh. I'm a professor of English at Colorado College with a specialization in the literature of empire and postcolonial literature. So I actually think the understanding of geographical imaginations is well expressed in the description of the panel as a geography of the mind and eye that does not necessarily map with physical locales. And I think if we think of the refugee crisis that's going on, we're going to see Syrian children growing up in Iceland and Germany, and so it's going to be a geography of the mind and eye there. I did wonder why, I mean, being a professor, of course, this is my business, I wondered why we use the term geographical imaginations rather than imaginative geography. And it could be that we want to avoid channeling Edward Said's use of that term, which references an imperial and hegemonic geography where a line is drawn between two continents, designating Europe as powerful and articulate, and Asia as defeated and distant. So Europe articulates the Orient, the prerogative, according to Said, not so much of a puppet master, but of a creator whose life-giving power represents, animates, constitutes the otherwise silent and dangerous space beyond familiar boundaries. So perhaps each of you can speak to your understanding of the term geographical imaginations and how that is implemented in your work. So perhaps, well, I'm not particular. Vijay, would you like to begin?
Nobody else is volunteering? You got it? No? Is this working? It is? Okay. Yeah, it is a vague and complicated subject, and all of us are sort of perceived, I think, by ourselves and by others, and maybe everyone in this audience, to be somehow from elsewhere, even though we are also from here, because we are here in this geographical space, and I guess that's why we're on the panel. So in some sense, the question actually problematizes us. And, you know, and to be rebarbative, I would have to say that I would kind of refuse that problematization, and I will do so by an anecdote that came out that that I related to Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who's also here and is a distinguished Indian poet. When we were having breakfast this morning, I was telling him about a cousin of mine who came later than we did to America. He's a hydraulic engineer, and he's worked for the city of Boston as an engineer for a long, long time, and he worked for the city of Providence before that. And he's been here since the 1970s, and every year he goes back to South India, to a little village outside of Bangalore, which is our ancestral village. And there is a temple there. And he has built up in his mind over the years a history of this temple. And there's a very particular ritual that takes place in the February of every year where this temple is somehow reconsecrated, or its sacred quality is reconstituted in some way. I don't quite know. There are probably Sanskritists in the audience who know a lot more about this than I do. And he has, because of his geographical dislocation and displacement, and because he is not prone to think of himself as a post-colonial person or a post-colonial intellectual, but merely someone who came here for a job, you know. He doesn't interpret in the way that we tend to interpret our own geographical destinies. And so he goes back every year and he has this idea of what we were as a people and what we are as a family, and he's very, very indignant about my not being interested in this at all. And, you know, having no interest, I never go back to India, I never, you know, when I grew up, when I got out of college when I was 20 years old, I hitchhiked across America, and I wound up here, actually, when Denver was a cow town, and then went to California. I always wanted to go to the wilderness. I never wanted to go to the settled places at all. And I still kind of feel reluctant about the settled places. And, but his idea is that about 800 years ago, some people who were Tamil-speaking Vaishnavites in the Tanjore area, which is now in Tamil Nadu, you know, a bunch of families moved from that area to this area outside of Bangalore, and they built this temple. And he has this idea of this long continuity in one geographical place, that we have 800 years of history in this place, and it's crucial to his identity. You know, and I never, and because I like him and care for him, I never really challenge him. I mean, I'll say, you know, I mean, a little skeptical tone will come into my voice, and, you know, but as I was saying to Arvind, and he was saying to me, you know, and he started this conversation that we were talking about, and I gave him this anecdote of my cousin, and I told him, and we both decided whether, and I think this is true, that really my cousin, like myself, and like our parents, like Arvind's parents in North India and my parents in South India, were really a product of an imperial history. And that we are really, our geographical place, if there is one, is the city of Bangalore, you know, which is definitely an imperial city, a product of the imperial history of India, the British imperial history of India. And subsequently, if I were to place myself in a geography, I would say that, you know, and, you know, I hope I won't be condemned by this audience for saying this, I am a New Yorker, you know. I am a product of that city. And while there's a lot of geography in my work, it's kind of shaped and formed by the fact that I have lived in New York for over 35 years now. And I have seen the world spreading itself out from this geographical location. And I feel very comfortable about that. You know, it's interesting in terms of all of this migrant movement and Donald Trump, and we're building a wall, you know, which is so ridiculous. Has he ever been down there? Does he know, you know, like what the landscape is, that you would build a wall? I mean, it's just so, you know, and all of the other Republican candidates go, yeah, we could build a wall. You know, nobody sits there and says, this is just the most absurd thing that any, you know, reasonably adult person has come up with. And, you know, and, you know, so in terms of sort of all of these issues of migration and who belongs where, and, you know, where people belong in terms of their histories, I would have to say that I'm very comfortable saying about myself, and saying also about my cousin, that no, you are not a part of this village and this ancient history that goes back 800 years and, you know, and has its roots in Tirupati or wherever, and Ramanujan and all of this stuff. You're a product of Bangalore, and then you're subsequently a product of Boston, and I'm a product of New York. You know, my consciousness is shaped and created by a current geography, and that's what makes my consciousness real. And so, you know, and I think geography is important for writers. It's crucial for writers. You know, we can't really distinguish ourselves from our landscapes. So I'll leave it at that.
And I think that really segues into Hari's work from my understanding, because in reading your novel, The Impressionist, I noticed a celebration of shape-shifting. As your main character, if you haven't read this novel, it's a bit of everything, picaresque and magical realism and It's really a novel of the imagination. And the main character changes names, identities, persona, and physical locations. But so, and yet, maybe, Hari, you can speak to what Vijay just said about people rooting themselves in one very specific, even temple, or just a concrete place within a place. But what I really saw as so profound in this novel is the dissolving of boundaries and binaries, which is how we've structured difference through the ages, race and difference, and even gender. And it's a dissolving of discrete ways of being, which, as I said, also applies to gender binaries as Rukhsana floats between worlds. So perhaps you could speak to that.
I suppose that novel comes out of my desire to unpack my own relationship with imperial history, for one thing, and the question of authenticity. I am the child of a Kashmiri Pandit father who emigrated from India to the UK, but there was also some prior migration down from Kashmir to UP, to Delhi and Allahabad and all around there in the family. So there was already a sort of displacement before he left India. My English mother, her ancestors go back to Norfolk farmers on one side and the Welsh hills in another. But my father's decision to go to the UK was clearly dictated by the historical links between India and Britain, and I grew up in a very white suburban part of London, and I was constantly being asked, "Where are you from?" And I would doggedly answer Woodford, which was and then there was no, "Where are you really from?" And I found this so upsetting. It kind of it's a profound. I mean, why I had to justify myself any more than the next person, and gradually I decided to sort of embrace my inauthenticity. I fail as an Indian in so many levels. I fail as an Englishman. I'm currently failing as an American in New York. But that failure is interesting to me. My failure to authentically embody any of these available positions is something that's shared by, I think, a great many people. And you know, we're especially mixed race people like me, we're said to lack roots, which is a suspicious thing that makes us disruptive, and it makes us people to be wary of. And you know, in the US, there's a long history of African American passing as white, and so I'm very, very interested in the question of how people negotiate racial lines, and that's been at the root of my fiction. I mean, sometimes I will say I don't have roots, I have aerials, as you know, a way of inverting that, and a way of saying that, especially for a writer, you carry your geography around with you. It's an imaginative geography. I mean, the fact was, as a kid, I was less interested in, let's say, an English tradition of fiction than I was an American tradition. And what am I supposed to do with it? I don't become an American because I like American books, but part of my imagination is formed by, you know, encountering Don DeLillo as an 18-year-old and more or less wanting to be him.
If you'll pardon me for getting academic for a second, both Homi Bhabha and Stuart Hall, two of the greatest cultural critics, talk exactly about that. Well, Homi Bhabha talks about hybridity and how it forms in the interstices of being, and Stuart Hall about how identity is never complete. It's always in production.
Can I just to add to that, the complexity of that? You know, I studied those people. They were important for me, kind of, you know, forming myself as a thinking person. But I become suspicious of this sort of simple valorization of hybridity, in that it seems to sort of somehow reinstate a purity that one is kind of talking to or against all the time. And especially now, I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, when people, I sometimes write comment pieces for the Guardian newspaper, and the online comment section of the Guardian is a particularly vicious and unpleasant place. So there'll be many hundreds of people insulting me after I've written what I thought was entirely innocuous material. And it's a favorite place for far-right trolls to hang out. And the thing they always come back to, they use a register of insult for me that would be familiar for Jewish people in the 1930s, this idea of the rootless cosmopolitan. And there are problems with asserting a simple cosmopolitan identity now. I think one of the most fatuous things you can possibly say is I am a citizen of the world, because there's a sort of privileged denial of the real forces that actually dictate where you are, what your possibilities are, and so on. So, but there is a sense in which the cosmopolitan identity is sort of embodied in style magazines, a sort of wallpaper magazine type places which will say, today I'm in Vienna shopping and having a coffee, tomorrow I will be in Delhi shopping and having a coffee. And, so I think one has to interrogate a simple idea of cosmopolitanism as well as an antidote to some sort of rooted nationalist or, nation-based writing identity.
I couldn't agree more, and we actually discussed this at a pre-festival panel of Colorado College professors. But it sort of takes away from my introduction of Antonio, as you'll see in a sec. But I do see that you are in a sense writing against the linear and progressive and very structured nature of the British construction of themselves. And I think both of you so far have addressed the very important issue of cultural citizenship. And so that's where I'll move to with Antonio. You may know, for instance, that when Michelle Kwan, the Chinese-American skater, lost the gold medal to a young white American skater, the Seattle Times headline was, Michelle Kwan loses gold to American skater. And she is third generation American. Now, when the President of the United States is denied cultural citizenship because his father was Kenyan and he's supposedly a Muslim or whatever, you can imagine. But so, Antonio, I was going to say that in the introduction to the Rumpus interview, this is how you're described. Antonio Ruiz-Camacho grew up in Toluca, Mexico, but now lives in Austin. For this interview, we met at Swad, an Indian restaurant in the north of the city, in a fresa salmon sweater and hipster nerd glasses, eating a dosa. Ruiz-Camacho was at his relaxed, multicultural best. You sound like the sort of cosmopolitan that Harry is speaking against. Can you define yourself? I don't want this to define you, you know.
Well, no. Can I put yeah, that was a funny introduction. I don't know. It's interesting to me that this sense of home. I think a lot of times I write about the sense of home in my stories. The collection that I published and that interview was about. It's about this family from Mexico City who has to leave, has to flee the country after their patriarch is kidnapped. And this is a privileged family. It's an upper class family in Mexico City, which is a kind of, let's say, Mexican community a lot of people are not very familiar with here in the US and even abroad. Now, when you think about Mexican immigrant, the image that you have is not someone who has a lot of power and a lot of money and who's fluent in English and doesn't have a problem settling down in the state. And these are, this was a family that had a lot of privileges in Mexico, and it's cosmopolitan, and they don't have a problem traveling abroad, but still they have this sense of dislocation, and they have to flee all their privileges behind and redefine themselves in a new country. And they have this sense of home stolen from them as a result of violence. And it's something that's completely unlike myself. I grew up in a small town, Toluca, which I wanted to leave as soon as possible. I wanted to go other places and live elsewhere. And I've lived in several cities in several countries. And I enjoy this sense of evolving identity, you know, how you can just steal elements from any place you go and kind of redefine yourself over and over. I enjoy that, you know, trying new things, reinventing myself all the time. And I think that goes counter the idea of this sense of home and identity, you know, these national identities that now we are seeing everywhere, that you have to be American. There's just one way to be American. There's just one way to be British. There's just one way to be Mexican. And it's so fascinating to me because I've never felt that, no? And how you can be from everywhere and not just have to be from one place specifically.
I don't know where the time's gone, but we have 5 minutes. Well, I have to give Ausma a chance. And Ausma, the thing that interests me so much about your novel is that you chose a detective novel to talk about the very serious and important topic of genocide and ethnic cleansing, which is, you know, so important for us to talk about. Someone on another panel said that the detective novel, or quoted someone saying that, is the only modern form. So I'm not sure what they meant by that, but why did you choose a detective novel for as your genre to talk about these, you know, these dreadful subjects?
I had addressed this question in an earlier panel this morning too, but one of the reasons I had done it was because I had been immersed in the war in Bosnia for a very long time in my own life, in my studies, and my activism, and I had always wanted to write about those crimes and those issues, and my background is in human rights law. Every time I approached the subject, I would find I could never get inside the story in a way that was authentic to me, and in a way that I felt could authentically represent the crimes that had taken place there. So what I relied on was my own lifelong love of mystery fiction and my familiarity with it and my comfort level with it. And because the story that's inside the mystery is such a heavy and dark story, I needed a lighter place with more distance to approach it so that it wouldn't overwhelm me and what I had learned and what I had studied, but also so that it wouldn't overwhelm the readers I was hoping to reach, who might not otherwise be interested in the subject matter, but who could approach from this form. And I think it gave me distance also to look at something that I hadn't had distance from in a very long time. And it's, I mean, I love suspense, and it's a good way to build a story, I think, and get people interested and intrigued and hanging on till the end to find out. And then for me personally, I felt it was a good way to make an audience care about issues that I cared about so passionately.
Yeah, and I'll get to the questions in just a sec. Don't worry. And but I just want to add that Ausma is also very engaged with the issues that we've been talking about, and especially the multicultural nature of Toronto, which is supposed to be one of the most multicultural cities in the world. But with that, I think what engages all the writers here is issues of identity. And to go back to what Antonio says, how do we define our own identities? And again, with what Harry said, having someone ask where you're really from, which Indian Americans get a great deal as well. You know, how do we employ our own agency to define ourselves? So, are there questions?
I've always been interested in the novels of immigrants coming to this country, and I was reminded of House of Sand and Fog and Tortilla Curtain, which are excellent novels about how immigrants come here and they're immediately stripped away of their identity. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that, Antonio, or...
Well, I think it... Oh, thanks. Oh, man. Well, it's interesting because it's not so much that they are stripped of their identity. It's just the need to keep going, you know, to settle down and to integrate yourself into society for many reasons. And I think, I don't know, we've been talking about these issues, especially because of all the migrants crisis in Europe right now, like differences. How do you experience the same expectations from a society in Europe or here, what immigrants are expected to do? And even though we have this hatred talk from Trump and conservatives, I think here we have a much more diverse community. You get to be many things, and on every day you get to define yourself as a Mexican American or just Mexican or Latino, and yes, there are these ideas about what you're supposed to be, but if you look around, you will see people from very different backgrounds, with issues, but coming together and doing their own thing, you know? I guess it's about having more representation of different identities in mainstream, you know? This idea that there's not one way to be American. You know, probably in the media we are represented in this way. Every day that's not what I perceive. You know, I've never felt, in my case, expected to be this way or this other way. And yeah, probably you could say, well, I came here and I was not fleeing my country, I knew the language, but I think you can develop your own identity here without having to conform to some specific expectations. That's my experience, probably I'm wrong.
I have a question. I lived a long time in San Antonio and Austin, and a lot of times when you come in, you end up in a Tex-Mex culture. Is it eerie or challenging because you have 4, 5, 10 generations of people who look like you but seem very weird?
New Yorkers should know how to answer that question too, man.
Yeah, we can maybe give it a twist.
Yeah, well, I don't know. My reaction to your question would be define weird, you know?
They seem like you, but they're not.
Well, that's part of the expectations. You know, it's like with Mexico, I don't know, this is a very recurrent story when middle-class Mexicans come to San Antonio to do some shopping because we have these huge shopping malls in San Antonio. And they come and say, hey, I saw these people who look Mexican. I started immediately talking to them in Spanish, and they don't know any Spanish. Why they don't know Spanish? It's like, why do you expect them to know Spanish? They are Americans. And then they are Mexican Americans from Mexican descent, but they are Americans first. why are you expecting them to speak Spanish just because they look Mexican? And that's where we need to start reformulating our idea of how you match your looks and your identity.
And also that geography, if you will, was Mexico before it was America, you know. It was originally a part of Spain, and you know, basically it was stolen by the Americans, you know, in a very unjust war, and the Spanish stole it before that, and you know, and so it just makes no sense. I mean, it's just so, you know, when you think of cultural geographies, especially of the Southwest and California and stuff like that, you know, in fact, the political reality is so opposed to the actual history and the actual cultural developments of that whole area, all the way up to here, you know. This was, you know, and think of the natives who were here, and, you know, I mean, are they American or not American? But if they're Native Americans, is it a Native hyphen American, or is the native an adjective that modifies American, you know? It all gets very, very tangled very quickly. Exactly. I mean, I think the big question is, don't put yourself in a position where you're answering questions that weren't asked, you know? When, you know, most people, like, they come up to you and, you know, I mean, I've been in America since Eisenhower was president, and they'll come up to me and say, where are you from? What they're saying, what they're really saying is, what the fuck are you doing here, you know? So you have to be able to, you know, you have to be able to see the real question behind the ostensible question. And, you know, and then respond to that, what they call now these days, that microaggression, and say, well, fuck you, you know, I mean, right, with actual aggression.
Well, we did start a little late, so can you give us one more question? One more, okay. This one.
Who benefits and who loses from immigration, both on a societal or a corporate or individual level?
I think maybe since
you know, I mean,
immigration lawyer, you may want to. Yeah.
I mean, that's such a huge question. I really don't know how to answer it. I worked in immigration law, and all I can say about that is that, you know, working in the Canadian immigration system, you're brushing up against the hopes and dreams of people from all around the world who have all different kinds of reasons for coming to a new country. And I think I really closely identified with everything that Antonio was saying, as opposed to what Hadi had to say about cosmopolitanism. I also have the sense that, because I come from a story of migration, which I used to think was complex and unique, but is actually very common in a globalized world. So my parents are both born in India, migrated to Pakistan, but originally are from Afghanistan, and then migrated to England, where I was born, and then migrated to Canada, where I grew up, and then for 10 years I've been in the States. So I really identify with this idea that you can belong anywhere, acquire things from anywhere. And I was also really interested in what Vijay had to say about his cousin wanting to express identification with this ancestral village, because both in my own life and in my fiction, I'm really fascinated by the idea of having a right to claim something. So from all these places, so I want to go and visit my father's village in India and identify with it. And I also want to know, you know, where in Kandahar my family was originally from. And I think it's, for me, maybe from a position of privilege, I don't know, but I've never had any trouble moving between all those identities and acquiring these new places and feeling a sense of belonging. But I'm conscious also that that is contingent somewhat on how I appear, and the question that you raised about passing. Because as a Muslim woman who's not visibly identifiable as a Muslim woman, there's a lot of very uncomfortable situations and conversations where I can easily pass right out of them if I choose to not self-identify. But I know that a lot of the girls that I grew up with don't have that option. I know that my brothers who are darker skinned have a different experience than I do. So, I mean, immigration is such a complex story, but I think it's very facile to say, but at least from my personal experience, it's such an enriching way of experiencing the world.